They say if you walk the old McCoy lands on a cold January night, when the wind moans through the bare sycamores, you can still hear her. A woman's voice, thin and full of sorrow, whispering two names into the darkness. Alifair Calvin. It's the ghost of Sarah McCoy, they say, the living curse of the great feud, a mother forever searching for the children who were murdered right before her eyes. But how does a person become a ghost while they're still breathing? How does a tough, resilient mountain matriarch, the very heart of a family, get broken so completely that her grief itself becomes a local legend? Hers is not a story of bullets and bravado. It's the story of what happens after the guns fall silent, and of a sorrow so deep it haunts the hills to this very day. Today, we separate the woman from the haint and trace the path that led Sarah McCoy into that long, lonely darkness. To understand the woman, you first have to understand the mountains that made her. Sarah Mullins was born in 1829 into a world of sharp ridges and deep, isolated hollows along the Kentucky side of the Tug Fork. This wasn't a land of easy living. It was a place that demanded everything from you: your strength, your sweat, your resilience. The seasons were harsh, the soil was rocky, and the outside world with its formal laws and governments was a distant rumor. Life was governed by a different set of rules: the turning of the seasons, the needs of the family, and the unwritten code of the hills. She was a Mullins before she was a McCoy, and like all mountain families, they lived by a simple, powerful creed: you take care of your own. Sarah's childhood wouldn't have been one of play and schooling. Her education came at her mother's side, learning the hard-won lessons of survival. She learned how to birth a child and how to bury one. She learned which roots could break a fever and which berries were poison. She learned to mend clothes, cure meat, and stretch a handful of cornmeal to feed a hungry family through the dead of winter. It was a life that forged a quiet, unbreakable strength into the very marrow of her bones. There are no documents that tell us of a single, defining moment in her youth. But the life of every mountain girl was filled with them. You can imagine a winter so fierce it threatened to starve the family out, and a young Sarah, not yet a woman, helping her mother keep a dying fire alive. You can picture her nursing a younger sibling through a sickness, learning for the first time that hollow-eyed fear that comes when a loved one's life hangs by a thread. These small, forgotten battles were her forge, tempering her into a woman who could endure hardship without complaint, because complaining was a luxury the mountains never afforded. In 1849, that quiet strength was joined with the formidable pride of Randolph McCoy. Randall, as he was known, was a stubborn, unbending man, quick to see a slight and slow to forgive a debt. When Sarah married him, she wasn't just becoming a wife, she was becoming the bedrock of a new dynasty. Her life's work would now be to build a family, to raise sons and daughters who carried the McCoy name. He was the stone wall facing the world. She was the mortar holding it all together, the quiet force that turned a rough log cabin into a home. Her code was not the code of the gunman or the feudist, not yet. Her code was the ancient, unspoken law of the Appalachian matriarch. It was a law written in the rhythm of a rocking chair, the smell of baking bread, and the fierce, protective glare she'd give anyone who threatened her children. Her honor wasn't tied to land disputes or stolen hogs. It was tied to the well-being of the 13 souls she brought into this world. Her domain was the hearth. Her ambition was a full pantry, and her loyalty was absolute, not to a cause, but to the lives she had created. Before the first shots of the feud echoed in her memory, Sarah McCoy's world was one of simple, profound purpose. Her domain wasn't the courthouse or the battlefield. It was a rough-hewn log cabin on a Kentucky hillside, a home that was overflowing with the noise and chaos of life. While Randall was out wrestling a living from the rocky soil or nursing a grievance with a neighbor, Sarah was the quiet gravity that held their chaotic world in orbit. The cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was her life's work, a testament to her endurance, filled with the smell of wood smoke and stew and the constant hum of her children's lives. And what a life it was. She was the mother of 13. Imagine that. 13 times she went through the trial of childbirth, and 13 times she held a new life in her arms. Her days weren't measured in hours, but in the tasks required to keep that many souls alive and well. It was an endless cycle of mending torn shirts, calming fevers with cool rags, breaking up squabbles between brothers, and singing the youngest ones to sleep. Her hands were never still. They were either kneading dough, churning butter, snapping beans, or gently brushing the hair from a sleeping child's face. She wasn't a woman given to grand pronouncements. Her strength was in her presence. When a child fell and scraped a knee, it was Sarah's lap they sought. When a son came home angry over some dispute, it was her steady gaze that could soothe the heat of his pride. She was the keeper of their stories, the witness to their growth. She saw the stubborn set of Randall's jaw in her son Talbot, and the quiet kindness in her daughter Alifair. She knew their fears, their dreams, and the secret hurts they hid from the world. For 2 decades, that world, while never easy, was whole. The rhythm of their lives was tied to the land. There was the hard work of planting in the spring, the relief of the summer harvest, and the huddling together for warmth and stories in the long, dark winters. This was the world Sarah McCoy had built and fought to protect. It wasn't a kingdom of wealth or power, but it was rich in what mattered most to her: the sight of her family, gathered and safe, under one roof. Her treasure wasn't a plot of land. It was the sound of her children's laughter echoing through the hollow. This was what was at stake. Not honor, not a family name, not the ownership of a stray pig. For Sarah, the escalating tensions with the Hatfields across the river were a terrifying threat to the only thing she held sacred. Every angry word Randall brought home, every dark rumor that drifted over the tug fork, was like a tremor beneath the foundation of her home. She was a mother standing guard over a precious, fragile peace, and she could feel a storm gathering on the horizon that threatened to wash it all away. Every great tragedy is driven by a fatal flaw, a crack in an otherwise strong foundation. For Randall McCoy, it was his unbending pride. For his sons, it was their quick, violent temper. But Sarah's flaw was something far more subtle and heartbreaking. It wasn't a sin, but a virtue taken to a terrible extreme: her absolute, unconditional love for her family. Her love was so powerful, so all-consuming, that it blinded her to any path that required her to stand against her husband or her sons. She saw her duty not as guiding them, but as enduring with them, no matter the cost. We see this flaw in sharp relief after the tragedy of 1882. The Hatfields had captured 3 of her sons, Talbot, Farmer, and Randolph Jr., and, in an act of brutal frontier justice, tied them to pawpaw trees and executed them. The grief that fell upon Sarah's house was a physical thing, a suffocating shroud. This was the moment where a different kind of woman might have broken. She might have screamed at Randall, "Your pride has already cost me 3 sons. Are you waiting for it to take the rest?" She could have begged him to leave the valley, to sell the land, to save what was left of their family from the fire of his feud. But she didn't. Her love and her grief fused into a kind of hardened, silent resolve. To suggest leaving would have felt like a betrayal of her murdered boy's memory. To question her husband's path would have been to break the sacred code of a mountain wife. And so, she stood by him. While the men spoke of honor and revenge, Sarah's world was one of empty chairs at the dinner table and ghosts in every corner of the cabin. Her loyalty, once the family's greatest source of strength and comfort, now became the quiet engine of its destruction. She would support their fight, even if it led them all to the grave. This unwavering devotion was, for most of her life, her greatest strength. It's what allowed her to raise 13 children in the harshest of conditions. It was the bedrock on which the McCoy family was built. But in the face of a blood feud, That same strength became a profound weakness. It made her a passive participant in her own family's annihilation. She couldn't see that sometimes the most loving act is to say no more. She couldn't imagine a world where her family was separated or their honor was compromised, and that inability to envision a different future trapped them all on the path to ruin. And so, she supported Randall's stubborn refusal to back down. She nursed the anger of her remaining sons and tended to the family's wounds, all while the storm gathered closer. Her flaw was not malice or pride. It was a love so deep it couldn't admit the possibility of defeat or retreat. She was the heart of the family, and she would continue to beat in rhythm with it, even as that rhythm became a death march. Her love had built their home. Now that same love would inadvertently help burn it to the ground. For 5 long years after the Paw Tree executions, the feud had become a war of whispers and shadows. The grief in Sarah's home was a constant, cold presence, but the open bloodshed had ceased. A fragile, unspoken truce held the valley in its grip, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. But in the winter of 1887, the McCoy clan, led by their kinsman and lawyer Perry Cline, made a fateful decision. They decided to fight the Hatfields, not with rifles in the hollers, but with warrants in the courts. This was the spark that would ignite an inferno. Cline, who held a deep personal grudge against the Hatfields, used his influence to have old murder warrants from 1882 reissued in Kentucky. He then deputized a rough, fearless man named Bad Frank Phillips to hunt down the Hatfields responsible for killing Sarah's sons. To the outside world, this was the law taking its course. But in the mountains, this was a profound and unforgivable insult. It was seen as a coward's move, an attempt to use outside authority to settle a family matter. You didn't send a lawman to do a man's work. It was a direct challenge to the sovereignty of the Hatfield clan and their patriarch, Devil Anse. The affront became an invasion when Frank Phillips and his posse crossed the Tug Fork into West Virginia. They were armed, they had the law on their side, and they began to hunt Hatfields on their own soil. They captured several men, and in the process, a Hatfield ally was killed. The news of this invasion, this violation of their territory by a McCoy-led force, reached Devil Anse like a declaration of war. The fragile truce was shattered. The Hatfields' response would not be in a courtroom. It would be swift, total, and merciless. For Sarah, this news was not a victory. It was a death sentence. When she learned that the law was being used as a weapon, a cold dread must have settled deep in her bones. She, more than anyone, knew the nature of the men they were provoking. She had seen their brand of justice firsthand at the base of 3 paw trees. While the men in her family may have felt a surge of righteous power, Sarah would have felt the earth begin to tremble beneath her feet. The point of no return had been crossed. The men had kicked the hornet's nest with the lawyer's boot, and she knew the swarm would be coming for her home. Her immediate visceral reaction wouldn't have been one of anger or pride, but of a mother's paralyzing fear. She would look at her daughter Alifair and her son Calvin, the 2 children who remained with her in that isolated cabin, and see them with new, terrified eyes. They were no longer just her children. They were the targets. Her fatal flaw, that unwavering loyalty, now chained her to this reckless course. She couldn't protest. She could only pray. The men had lit the fuse, and Sarah was left to do nothing but watch it burn closer and closer to her door. For the first time in 5 years, a dangerous kind of hope flickered in the McCoy men. With Frank Phillips and his posse raiding West Virginia, they felt the tide turning. Justice, or at least their version of it, seemed within reach. But the whispers that drifted back across the Tug Fork were as cold and dark as a winter creek. Friends and neighbors, men who knew the Hatfields not as names on a warrant, but as flesh and blood forces of nature, brought warnings to Randall. They spoke in low, urgent tones of men gathering at Devil Anse's command, of the cold fire they'd seen in Jim Vance's eyes. These weren't formal offers of peace. The time for that had long passed. These were the desperate pleas of a community that could feel the ground getting ready to shake. "Take your family and go, Randall," one might have said. "Go to Pikeville, anywhere, just until this blows over. A piece of paper won't stop a bullet." They were warnings born of experience, a deep mountain wisdom that understood that provoking a man like Jim Vance was like cornering a rattlesnake. You might have the right to do it, but you'd be a fool to expect to walk away unharmed. But Randall McCoy, his pride now buttressed by the authority of the law, was deaf to these pleas. To him, leaving would be running. It would be an admission of defeat, a betrayal of the sons already in the ground. "We have the law on our side now," he'd retort, his jaw set like stone. He mistook the warrants in his pocket for a shield, believing the outside world's rules now applied to this ancient, personal war. He and his remaining sons walked with a newfound confidence, blind to the fact that they were marching their families straight towards an open grave. Sarah saw it, though. She saw the truth not in Randall's defiant words, but in the silence that followed them. She saw it in the way neighbors averted their eyes, in the sudden quiet that fell over a room when she entered. She could feel her family being walled off, isolated by her husband's stubborn pride. The warnings the men ignored, she heard as a deafening roar. She knew the Hatfields. She knew what they had done to her boys at the pawpaw trees, and she knew they had done it without the pretext of a legal invasion. What would they do now, with their homes raided and their kinfolk dragged away in irons? Her path of no compromise was one of silent, terrified endurance. Every day that passed was another missed opportunity to flee. Every sunset that painted the winter sky felt like a final act. The cabin, once her sanctuary, began to feel like a trap made of logs and pride. While her husband saw their stand as a matter of honor, Sarah saw only the shrinking circle of safety around her children. The men were too busy listening to the lawyers and the deputies to hear the sound that Sarah heard every night in her sleep, the sound of approaching footsteps in the snow. And so, with every warning ignored, with every chance for escape dismissed, the certainty of a violent end grew. The feud was no longer a simmering conflict. It was a runaway wagon careening downhill, and the McCoy family was tied to the driver's seat. Their isolation was now complete. They were alone in their holler, surrounded by a world that was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable crash. The only question left was how terrible the wreckage would be. The final chance for peace didn't come with a white flag or a parley at the river's edge. It came in the dead of night, on New Year's Eve, 1887, inside the four walls of the McCoy cabin. It came not as a negotiation, but as a wife's desperate plea to her husband. The children were asleep, their breathing soft and even in the cold air. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the low moan of the wind outside, a sound that seemed to be whispering a warning. Sarah sat watching the fire, but she wasn't seeing the flames. She was seeing the faces of her sleeping children, Calvin and Alifair, and the image of them was superimposed over the memory of her 3 dead sons. The fear she had been swallowing for weeks finally rose in her throat, too powerful to be contained. She turned to Randall, who sat cleaning a rifle, his face a grim mask in the flickering light. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Randall, let's leave this place." He stopped his work, the sound of the oiled rag on steel falling silent. He didn't look at her. "Leave? And go where? This is our home, woman." But Sarah pressed on, her words tumbling out in a torrent of a mother's terror. "To Pikeville, just for a while. Let the lawmen do their work. The land will be here when we come back, Randall. The house will be here. But the children, I can't lose any more children." This was her one and only act of defiance, a desperate attempt to place the lives of her family above the honor of their name. For a brief, flickering moment, the iron in Randall McCoy's gaze seemed to soften. He looked over at his son, Calvin, a young man now, asleep by the fire. He looked at his daughter, Alifair, her face peaceful in her dreams. He saw the genuine, heart-stopping fear in his wife's eyes. This was the crossroads. He could choose his family, or he could choose his feud. He could choose life, or he could choose the dirt his ancestors were buried in. The entire weight of the McCoy family's future rested on the next words to leave his mouth. He shook his head, slowly at first, then with a final, terrible certainty. And let them say I ran? Let Jim Vance and his murdering kin tell their children that Randall McCoy was a coward who abandoned his home and the graves of his sons. He stood up, his voice low and hard. No, Sally. We are McCoys. We don't run. With that, the final door slammed shut. He had made his choice. He had chosen pride. Sarah said nothing more. She simply stared into the fire as the last ember of hope died, turning to cold, grey ash. The silence that filled the cabin now was the silence of a tomb waiting for its occupants. It started not with a shout, but with the sound of the world breaking. A splintering crash from the door, and then the night outside the McCoy cabin exploded. The family's dogs, which had been barking frantically, fell suddenly, horribly silent. The air turned to thunder. Flashes of orange light punched through the thin wooden walls, each one a deafening crack that seemed to rip the fabric of the cold January night. For Sarah, the world shrank to the terrified faces of her children, illuminated in strobing, violent bursts of light. The cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a cage. Then came a new smell, sharp and hungry. Kerosene. A sudden, whooshing bloom of light appeared at the windows and beneath the doors, painting the inside of the cabin in a ghastly, dancing orange. The dry roof caught with a hungry roar, and the heat became a living thing, a monster breathing down on them, driving them out into the open. Smoke, thick and acrid, filled their lungs, turning every breath into a choking gasp. The home Sarah had built with her own two hands was now a furnace, an altar for a terrible sacrifice. Her son Calvin, now a man, grabbed a rifle, his face a mask of desperate courage. He lunged for the main doorway, a silhouette against the rising flames, trying to give his family a chance to escape out the back. From the darkness came a single sharp report, a sound louder and more final than all the others. The argument that had been Calvin's young life was suddenly, permanently over. He simply crumpled and was gone from the doorway, leaving a void where her son had stood just a heartbeat before. A new sound cut through the chaos, Alifair's scream, raw with terror and grief. "Stop it, please, stop!" She bolted from the smoke-filled room into the freezing yard, a desperate prayer on her lips, her hands outstretched as if she could physically push back the violence. Outside, in the hellish, flickering firelight, another shot rang out across the holler. The screaming stopped, just like that. In the snow, her daughter's frantic motion ceased, and a terrible, unnatural stillness took its place. Instinct, the purest and most primal force a mother knows, took over. Sarah scrambled out into the freezing air, her world narrowing to the still shape in the yard. She fell to her knees beside Alifair, a mother's wail tearing from her throat, a sound of absolute ruin. A dark shape loomed over her, a man's form silhouetted against her burning home. There was a swift, dark movement in the air above her. Not a sound, not a pain, just a blinding flash of white light behind her eyes. The world tilted on its axis. The roar of the fire and the crackle of gunfire faded to a distant, muffled hum. The cold, soft snow rose up to meet her, and the night, which had been so full of fire and noise, went utterly and completely black. The first thing she felt was the cold. Not the bracing cold of a winter night, but a deep, seeping cold that seemed to be coming from inside her own bones. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a slow, agonizing crawl out of a black, silent pit. There was a ringing in her ears, and the ground was wet beneath her cheek. The sharp, bitter smell of wet ash and burnt pine filled the air. For a moment, there was nothing else, just cold, silence, and the smell of ruin. Slowly, She pushed herself up. A crushing weight of pain exploded in her skull, a blinding agony that made the world swim. Her hand went to her head and came away slick and dark, with something that wasn't melted snow. Her eyes focused. Above her, the stars were still glittering, cold and indifferent. But where her home should have been, there was only a jagged black skeleton, its ribs smoldering faintly against the night sky. And then, she remembered, fire, gunshots, screaming. Her gaze fell upon a shape in the snow nearby, a dark bundle, unnaturally still. Alifair. The name was a thought, not a sound. Sarah crawled towards her, the pain in her head forgotten, her body moving with a will of its own. The snow beneath her daughter was stained a dark, impossible color. She reached out a trembling hand and touched her child's face. It was as cold as the frozen earth. A great, silent bell had been struck inside her soul, and the ringing had shattered everything. There was no scream, no cry. The sound was trapped somewhere deep inside her, unable to escape. Her eyes lifted toward the charred remains of the doorway. She saw him then. Calvin. What was left of him? The sight did not add to the horror. It simply confirmed it. The world had ended. This was what came after. She was no longer a wife or a mother. She was a witness, a survivor left behind in the graveyard of her own life. There was no triumph, no shock, no regret. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness where a heart had once been. She didn't flee into the mountains. She didn't stand her ground. She simply knelt there in the blood-soaked snow, a frozen statue between her two dead children, staring at the smoldering corpse of her home. Hours later, when the first grey light of dawn threatened the sky, Randall and the others who had escaped crept back out of the woods. They found her there. She looked at them, but her eyes were vacant, seeing something far away, or perhaps nothing at all. Randall had survived the night, but the woman he found in the ashes was not the wife he had left behind. The Sarah McCoy, who had raised 13 children and anchored a family, was gone forever, and in her place was only a ghost. The fire that consumed the McCoy cabin sent shockwaves of a different kind across the mountains. The immediate wreckage wasn't just timber and ash, it was human. Randall McCoy, a man whose pride had forbidden him from leaving his home, was now forced to lead a ragged procession of ghosts away from the tug fork. They were homeless, landless, and carrying with them a grief so heavy it was a physical burden. Their destination was Pikeville, a town that offered safety, but also the quiet shame of exile. They were refugees from a war they had helped start, driven from their ancestral land not by an army, but by the hatred of their neighbors. But the most profound piece of wreckage was Sarah herself. They had managed to save her body from the flames, but her spirit had been left behind in the snow with Alifair and Calvin. She was now a walking wound, a constant, silent testament to the horror of that night. For her surviving children, the burden was twofold. They had to mourn the siblings they had lost, while simultaneously caring for a mother who no longer recognized them, who looked through them as if they were made of glass. Every meal they prepared for her, every time they led her gently back indoors from a wandering daze, was a fresh reminder of how much had been stolen from them. They hadn't just lost a home, they had lost the heart of their family. News of the New Year's massacre spread through the hollows, not like a rumor, but like a pestilence. This wasn't another chapter in the feud. This was something different, something darker. Ambushing armed men on a trail was one thing. Executing prisoners by a pawpaw tree was brutal, but it followed a certain grim frontier logic. But setting fire to a family's home in the dead of night and shooting down an unarmed woman and a boy in their own yard, that violated even the most primitive mountain codes. The attack shattered any local sympathy the Hatfields might have had. It transformed them from proud patriarchs defending their territory into a pack of midnight murderers. This singular act of brutality, intended to end the McCoy line for good, instead sealed the Hatfields' own doom. The story of the massacre and of Sarah's tragic state lit a fire under the authorities in Kentucky. The feud was no longer a local squabble. It was now a manhunt, sanctioned and funded by the state. Bad Frank Phillips's posse was no longer just a band of McCoy allies. It was the arm of the law, and its hunt for Jim Vance and the others became a relentless crusade. The fire didn't end the war. It escalated it into a final bloody chapter that would lead to pitched battles, arrests, and ultimately, the gallows. The tragedy, in the end, belonged to everyone. The ashes of the McCoy cabin were the funeral pyre not just for Alifair and Calvin, but for any hope of a peaceful resolution. It left a permanent scar on the community, deepening the lines of hatred and distrust that would poison the valley for another generation. The true wreckage wasn't a burned-out foundation on a Kentucky hillside. It was the countless broken lives, both Hatfield and McCoy, left behind in the wake of a single night of unimaginable violence. The New Year's massacre didn't just burn down a cabin, it set fire to the unwritten rules of the feud. The law didn't just cross the tug fork anymore, it kicked down the door. Frank Phillips and his posse, now acting with the full fury of the Kentucky government behind them, hunted the raiders with a vengeance. Several Hatfields and their allies were captured, bound, and dragged across the river to stand trial in Pikeville. To the state of Kentucky, this was the legitimate capture of fugitive murderers. To West Virginia, it was an armed invasion and a kidnapping. The clash was no longer just between two families, it was between two states. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Imagine that. A blood feud born of stolen pigs and mountain pride was now being debated by the highest legal minds in the nation. In a landmark decision, the court sided with Kentucky, ruling that they had the right to prosecute the captured men. It was a stunning moment. For the first time, the formal black-robed law of the outside world had officially superseded the ancient, bloody code of the mountains. The federal government had declared that the tug fork was not a border between two kingdoms, but simply a line on a map that justice could cross at will. The Pikeville courthouse became a theater for this culture clash. On one side stood the machinery of the law, prosecutors in starched collars, law books filled with complex language, and a judge who represented a power far greater than any clan patriarch. On the other side stood the accused, men like Ellison Cottontop Mounts. He was a rough-hewn product of the mountains, a man who lived by a code of loyalty to his kin and whose understanding of justice was likely settled with a fist or a firearm. He sat in the courtroom, a bewildered and defiant figure, as his fate was debated in a language he barely understood. The community was torn in two. For the McCoys and their sympathizers, who packed the Kentucky side of the courtroom, this was divine retribution. They didn't see Cottontop Mounts the man. They saw the embodiment of the Hatfield clan, the face of the evil that had burned down Sarah's home and murdered her children. Every word of the prosecution was a vindication of their suffering. But across the river and among the Hatfield allies, the trial was seen as a sham, a legal lynching. They saw Cottontop not as a criminal, but as a political prisoner, a scapegoat being sacrificed to satisfy a Kentucky vendetta. He was their martyr. The verdict, when it came, was as swift and certain as a Hatfield bullet. Guilty. The sentence was even more final. Death by hanging. The law, which had for so long been a distant and irrelevant concept, had finally bared its teeth. Its judgment was absolute, and it promised a public, orderly, and legal end to a man's life, a stark contrast to the chaotic, passionate violence that had defined the feud for decades. But was it true justice? That's the question that still hangs over the valley. Cottontop Mounts was just a follower, rumored to be simple-minded, a man caught up in the powerful currents of clan loyalty. The masterminds of the raid, Jim Vance and Cap Hatfield, had escaped the noose. Vance was already dead, shot by Frank Phillips, and Cap would eventually be pardoned. The law had claimed its pound of flesh, and the hanging of cotton-top mounts officially marked the end of the feud. But for many, it felt less like a resolution and more like a final bitter irony. A war started by powerful men had ended with the execution of one of their weakest soldiers. So, what became of the men who brought hell to Sarah McCoy's doorstep? Did they face a reckoning of their own? The answer, like everything in this story, is a tangled mess of violence, irony, and unsatisfying justice. The fates of the Hatfield leaders show that in the mountains, the ledger of right and wrong is rarely balanced so neatly. Jim Vance, the old wolf of the clan, the man widely believed to have delivered the crippling blow to Sarah's head, met a fittingly violent end. He was hunted relentlessly by Frank Phillips, who pursued him not with a warrant, but with the cold fury of an avenger. In January 1888, just weeks after the massacre, Phillips cornered Vance in the woods. There was no trial, no judge. There was only a final, brutal shootout. Jim Vance, who had lived his life by the gun, died by the gun, his body left in the frozen wilderness. For the McCoys, this was the only kind of justice they could truly understand. But for the others, the law's judgment was far more elusive. Cap Hatfield, Devil Anse's hot-headed son and another leader of the raid, was a ghost to the law. He dodged posses and hid in the mountains until the political winds shifted. Thanks to the bitter jurisdictional disputes between Kentucky and West Virginia, Cap was eventually granted a pardon. He never spent a day in jail for the New Year's raid. In a twist of staggering irony, the man who had acted as judge, jury, and executioner in Sarah's yard went on to become a lawyer and land agent, living a long and prosperous life. He died an old man, a respected member of his community, the blood of that night, a distant, unpunished memory. And what of the patriarch himself, Devil Anse Hatfield? He was the man in whose name it was all done, yet he never faced a single legal consequence for the feud. He outlived Randall McCoy by a decade, transitioning from a feared clan leader to a successful timber baron. The Hatfields, far from being destroyed, became a powerful and influential family in West Virginia politics. On the surface, it seems Devil Anse won. But a strange thing happened in his old age. In 1911, this man who had seemed to fear neither God nor the law waded into the waters of Island Creek and was baptized. The image of the old feudist, his hands now trembling with age, seeking to wash away a lifetime of sin, suggests a man who was, in the end, haunted. He may have escaped man's law, but it seems he was making a final, desperate peace before facing a higher judgment. For the surviving McCoys, life in Pikeville was a long, quiet epilogue written in the ink of grief and exile. Randall, the proud patriarch who had refused to abandon his home, now lived out his days as a ferryman, a humbled and broken man. His children grew up under a long shadow, forever known as the feud McCoys. They couldn't escape the name. It was whispered in the general store, it followed them to school, it clung to them like the smell of wood smoke. Some tried to build new lives to distance themselves from the bloody history, but the story was a brand on their family name, a legacy of loss they would carry to their own graves. Back in the Tugfork Valley, a strange and heavy silence descended. The hanging of cotton-top mounts had drawn a formal line under the conflict, and the community, exhausted by years of violence and fear, collectively decided to bury the memory. Neighbors who had once aimed rifles at each other from opposite sides of the river now had to pass on the same dusty roads, trade at the same stores. The only way to survive was to not speak of it. The feud became the great unspeakable trauma, a ghost in the attic that everyone knew was there, but no one dared acknowledge. The healing was not a process of reconciliation, but of willed amnesia, a fragile peace built on a foundation of unspoken horror. The power dynamics of the region had been permanently redrawn. The fall of the McCoys from the Tugfork was absolute. Their land was gone, their influence shattered, their name reduced to a cautionary tale. But for the Hatfields, the feud had the opposite effect. It cemented their legend and consolidated their power in West Virginia. They transformed their notoriety into political and economic capital. Devil Anse's sons became sheriffs, lawyers, and businessmen. The Hatfields, far from being destroyed by the conflict, had emerged as a formidable Appalachian dynasty, their success built, quite literally, upon the ashes of the McCoy homestead. And in the middle of this silent, shifting landscape was the memory of Sarah. While the men's names became synonymous with the fighting, her story endured as the symbol of its true cost. She was the ghost that haunted the community's silence. The men's legacy was one of pride, violence, and shifting power. Hers was a legacy of pure, inconsolable sorrow. Long after the last shot was fired and the last grave was dug, it was the image of the broken mother, wandering the hills and calling for her lost children, that served as the feud's most chilling and enduring epitaph. If you travel to the Tug Fork Valley today, you can find the place where it all happened. The state has put up a historical marker, a neat metal sign that tries to tame the wildness of the story with dates and official language. But the sign isn't what holds the power of that place. A little farther in, you can still see the foundation stones of the cabin, half buried in the earth. And you can see the old well, its stone ring, a silent, hollow mouth in the ground. To stand there is an eerie experience. The air is heavy with a profound and unsettling quiet, and you can't help but feel you are trespassing on sacred, sorrowful ground. A few miles away, in a small cemetery, you can find their names carved into weathered stone. Randall lies there, and Sarah is beside him. Their graves are simple, unadorned, the final factual statements in a story that has since become a legend. People come from all over the country now, tracing the feud's bloody map from one site to another. They take pictures of the tombstones, treating them like relics of a distant, almost mythical past. But the names etched there, McCoy, Alifair, Calvin, are a stark reminder that these were real people, with real lives that were violently, tragically cut short. The story of Sarah, however, did not get buried in that cemetery. It seeped into the soil and became part of the folklore of the hills. Long after she died, people kept telling the stories. They weren't talking about Crazy Sally anymore. They were talking about a true spirit, a haint bound to the land by the force of her grief. Hunters moving through the woods at dusk would swear they heard a woman's voice carried on the wind, whispering those two names. Travelers would tell of a sudden, bone-deep cold that would settle over them near the old cabin site, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. Her tragedy has been transformed. It's now a key chapter in the American saga of the Hatfields and McCoys, a cautionary tale told to children about the poison of hatred. It has been written into books, acted out on television, and even sung about in mournful mountain ballads. The raw, private agony of one woman has become a public ghost story, a piece of our shared dark heritage. The world remembers the feud as a story of stubborn, violent men, but it is the ghost of Sarah McCoy that gives the legend its soul-chilling power. And so, she endures. Devil Anse, Randall McCoy, Frank Phillips, they are figures of history, their actions debated and analyzed. But Sarah is a figure of pure, human tragedy. She is the mother who lost everything, the woman whose mind was broken by a sorrow too great to bear. The men's spirits may rest in the ground, their battles long over. But her spirit, the spirit of a mother's eternal, inconsolable grief, that is the one that still truly haunts these mountains. So we come back to the question we asked at the beginning. How does a person become a ghost while they are still breathing? The life of Sarah McCoy gives us the terrible answer. She was neither a hero nor a villain in this legendary war. She was the battlefield itself. The men fought over honor, land, and pride, but it was on the terrain of her heart that the true cost was tallied. Her story strips away any romance from the feud and shows us the raw, ugly truth. The deepest wounds aren't made by bullets, but by the memories they leave behind. In the end, this is a story about the terrible math of hatred. It shows that in a conflict fueled by pride, the price is always paid by the innocent. It is a brutal lesson that a mother's love, the most powerful force in the human world, cannot shield her children from the consequences of the foolishness of men. The curse of Sarah McCoy wasn't supernatural. It was the simple, horrifying curse of survival, of being the one left behind to count the graves and remember the screams. The names Hatfield and McCoy are now written in history books, symbols of a uniquely American conflict. But while their war is long over, her sorrow endures. And that, my friends, is the true ballad of the Tugfork Valley. A story not of the men who fired the guns, but of the mother whose unending grief became the feud's most haunting ghost.